Hello. We are excited to introduce to you Gregory Geffen, Esquire of Geffen Law Firm. We are thrilled to introduce him as our expert today in all things law in South Florida.
How are you, Greg? Welcome.
I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Always good to be here.
Greg and I have known each other, Sarina, for at least, I would say, probably as long as I'm doing this, 23 years. He was the in-house counsel at my last real estate firm. So we just bonded and we formed a special relationship. And in real estate, you always want that kind of relationship for your clients. So I always felt comfortable with Greg because he always took a practical approach to resolving problems if there were issues or problems.
Thanks. Yeah, it's after you've been around here a while, you as the commercial says, you know a thing or two because you've seen a thing or two. And, I take it to heart that solving problems and trying to help people, the answers are not always set forth in the four corners of the contract. That sometimes you have to be a little bit practical and a little bit pragmatic when there's people involved and emotions are involved, especially when it comes to residential real estate and people making transitions and changes in their lives. So I try to look just beyond what's on the paper and see what somebody's actual needs are in order to get a deal done and to make them happy and to have everybody happy in one of these situations.
The number one question I always get, especially from the Northeastern clients, because they're always represented by counsel, Colby, do I need a lawyer? So that's our first question, Greg. You tell me the answer to that so the people could hear it from you.
Okay. Well, the answer is yes, but otherwise it would be a very short podcast. So, it smacks of self-interest whenever somebody asks me, calls me up and says, I was referred to you by so-and-so, I was referred to you by Colby. Do I really need a lawyer in South Florida or, to handle my closing? I know a lot of my friends and family have closed deals down here without a lawyer, but up north, nobody would do anything. Nobody would even, sign anything or even look at a contract without a lawyer involved. So I'll briefly explain the difference, and I'll try to explain why I think it's the right move is to hire somebody, depending on whether you're the buyer or the seller, what the circumstances are. So in other jurisdictions, particularly up north, like New York and New Jersey, real estate agents are not permitted to write contracts. They interpret that as the unlicensed practice of law. And they have some promulgated forms, but those forms are really from the Bar Association and not necessarily from real estate agents. Down here, you don't necessarily need a lawyer to write a contract because as long as you or your colleagues are using the Florida Association of Realtors promulgated forms, you're not practicing law. And it specifically states on those forms, this is a legally binding contract. If you have any questions or need interpretation, please see and speak to an attorney. So there's a lot of agents that, for whatever purpose, don't necessarily recommend a lawyer because they're going to go ahead and muck things up and over lawyer it and over, generate a lot of unnecessary language and tear through the contract. And that's not necessarily my job. My job is to help you understand what you're signing and making sure that it works for you. So people always say to me, hey, Greg, this seems pretty boilerplate. Do I really need you? What are we going to do? And I'm going to say, yeah, it is boilerplate. Everything's normal. Everything's customary and everything appears to be in order. But that doesn't necessarily solve your specific questions or your specific issues. So most of the time, my job is merely to reinforce what a client's rights and responsibilities are when it comes to interpreting a contract, and also to be there with a file open and ready to react in case an issue happens, in case something happens. That's it's almost like having some type of peace of mind insurance is to get somebody like me involved to assist you and walk you through the process. It is one of the largest transactions personal transactions that the majority of people make in their lives is buying or selling a home. So they might as well have somebody for the relatively small fee involved, review the documents, make sure that everything appears to be correct, be on the lookout for any mistakes that the other title company or the other lawyer might be making that you don't want to have to spend time clearing up after closing. And being there to make sure that your client's rights are preserved. And that's what I do on a day in, day out basis.
So hire Greg for that peace of mind and all of that practical advice. Fantastic.
And a lot of clients seem to find, and agents seem to find that, what was the joke from Danny DeVito in one of those movies? I think it was Other People's Money, where he said lawyers, they're like nuclear warheads. They have theirs, I have mine, and as long as we keep them in the silos, there's détente.
That is true.
Sometimes I'm upset that the other side doesn't have a lawyer, because there would be somebody unemotional that I could speak to and reason with, than an agent who's emotionally invested in the deal, or a client that's obviously very emotionally invested in the deal.
There are a lot of different kinds of contracts out there.
Sure.
A lot of people right now in today's world are writing as is contracts.
Sure.
Can you explain to people maybe the pros and cons with an as is or not as is?
Yeah, sure. Down here in Florida, most of the contracts are written on the Florida Bar and Florida Association of Realtors promulgated forms. And they don't change too much year over year. Sometimes we just had a major revision concerning financing and other things. But, there's always the fork in the road as to whether or not you go with an as-is contract or what I'll call an inspection contract, where you go to contract, you do an inspection, and then you provide, the seller's required to make certain structural or functional repairs, not cosmetic, but structural functional repairs up to a certain percentage of the purchase price. And neither party could cancel unless the repairs exceed a certain amount. And the parties can't negotiate some type of compromise. In an as-is contract, the parties agree that the buyer's buying the property as is. The buyer cannot force the seller to make any repairs that come up, but the buyer does have what I call a free bite at the apple, meaning that they have 7 to 10 or 15 days, whatever amount of time the parties agree on, to decide that the property is suitable, to do their due diligence and decide if the property is suitable, and they could cancel for any reason, with or without an inspection. So that seems to be the standard that most agents are working with these days. And there's pros and cons to each contract, but we've just basically accepted that the as is basically the benchmark standard for people to use. The pro is that if you're working with a buyer that's somewhat maybe on the fence, but just in this market wants to see if they're going to get an accepted offer on a property, and might want to just, be able to take a pause once they were able to work out a price and go to contract and take a look at things. That's an advantage for the buyer, that they do have an out, a free bite at the apple. It's also an advantage for the seller because he doesn't have to be forced to make a lot of Mickey Mouse repairs on a house when a lot of that stuff is already baked into the cake, financially. But it does have its downsides too. It's, you're tying up a property for maybe a buyer that's maybe not acting genuinely, and maybe making multiple offers just so they can tie up some property. That's always a risk, that you could be wasting some time in this market. But that seems to be the standard. The advantage of an inspection and cancellation, an inspection contract, is that once you have an offer that you've both agreed on, the buyer's locked. And as long as the seller's willing to do those repairs and perform the repairs, whatever comes up on the inspection report, that the buyer's locked. They can't cancel. So, that's something to certainly consider when you're negotiating, particularly if you have multiple offers on the table, and maybe you want to take an offer from a buyer that's that you're willing to accept. Maybe it's not as financially strong as the next offer, but maybe this offer is cash and there's no financing contingency. And maybe they have a closing date that's a little bit more acceptable to you. So you might want to consider, depending on what condition the house is in, of doing a non-as-is with the right to cancel contract. But it seems to be that the non-as-is contract is more of the exception than the rule these days. So, that's the time to maybe speak to you as your agent, maybe speak to somebody like me and figure out what works best for all the parties. Hope I answered that question good.
That's great.
Well, I think that's kind of getting into one of our big questions about other risks, right? So there was this question about risks that a buyer could foresee when submitting cash offer, but then they also want to get financing. So that was like one of, just among the many risks that buyers can kind of anticipate.
We all know what's going on in the market right now. It's a very strong market from the standpoint of the sellers, and it's very hard for a buyer to jump in between the low inventory and the escalating prices and bidding wars in certain communities. It's very hard for a buyer to nudge their way in. So a lot of sellers are demanding cash contracts. A cash contract doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get financing. But it does mean that any financing issues, you as the buyer bear all the risk in a cash contract. Appraisal issues, qualification issues, things like that. So a buyer has to make some very strong decisions as to how much they want to risk, and perhaps that as is contract. If there is going to be a reasonable due diligence period. In a cash contract, maybe they could escalate certain things relative to their financing that they could vet during this interim due diligence period, such as, getting an appraisal, checking with the bank to make sure that they can underwrite the type of loan in this type of community, particularly if it's a condo. So a buyer could use that due diligence period, to decide if it's going to work with them and if they're going to risk their deposit on the financing failing. So, most of the buyers that I work with, that write cash contracts, the first question I ask them is if I know they're getting a loan, if the loan doesn't happen on time, are you prepared to close cash? Do you have the resources, whether it be getting an equity line on your current home? Do you have the resources to close cash? I don't want to have this conversation with you 30 days from now, 45 days from now. So, for example, on some contracts, I'll have the seller stipulate that this is an all-cash deal. There's no financing contingency. However, the parties acknowledge that the buyer is getting financing, and the seller will cooperate with buyer's lender without there being a specific contingency. So, for example, the seller will allow the buyer's lender's appraiser to come to the property and perform an inspection and appraisal. The seller will sign any loan documentation that the buyer's lender needs, participation from the seller, in order to be compliant with whatever government regulations and FINRA and TRID govern the closing. So things like that is we have to anticipate.
Yeah, that really hit on a lot. I have one more, Greg. I know we said three, but I have one more that always comes up, and Serena, it's very funny. People always think that they can either do a regular check or a cashier's check when you are going to the closing table. Greg, set this right now so people understand you have to wire funds for a closing. Why is that?
Yeah, well, what happened is that we used to be able to take cashier's checks, and then a couple of things happened. Number one, there was a lot of cashier's check fraud that was happening in the last real estate crisis, and it was also determined that a cashier's check is not collected funds. The contract that your client signed, Colby, specifically states that the cash to close has to be by wire transfer or other collected funds, which means, they hand me a cashier's check at closing, I still have to deposit it with the bank, and my bank needs to clear it with the client's bank. Cashier's checks could be stop paid, and I haven't specifically seen it, but I've seen it happen before, where maybe a title company's handed a cashier's check, we do the closing, and then the client goes back to the house and realizes that there's a problem. And the client feels that the only way to solve the problem is to stop the closing. So what do? They immediately call their bank that issued them the cashier's check and said, there's a problem, I need to put a stop pay on this cashier's check. So that would mean that Greg Geffen or whatever other title company does not have collected funds that they could disperse on. That's why best practices now calls for a wire transfer. However, there's been a lot of problems with wire transfers over the last number of months. I've been privy to some very specific problems with email. There's email hacking schemes, and there's people that get phished and spoofed, and people they think they're dealing with somebody from the title company that sends them a wire instructions and instructions that they have to wire it today, or otherwise they're going to it's not going to clear in time for closing, and they don't follow up with it, and there's significant consequential problems. So you guys should be well trained on how to prevent wire fraud and how to verify wires. And I think FAR even has a wire fraud disclosure that each client has to sign. So that's been a lot of the pushback that I've been getting lately about wires.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, you heard it first. So Colby is not a lawyer. I sell real estate, but if you do want a lawyer, tell them, Greg, tell them how can they reach you if they want to hire you?
Sure. Well, they could call our office number at Geffen Law is 561-988-0088. They could email me at greg@geffenlaw.com. I'm sure you'll be able to put a little caption in there by the time this airs. Or you can go to my website, which is www.geffenlaw.com. I've been doing this in town for 25 years. I've run a team of about 12 or 13 people, including 5 closers and a associate attorney who's becoming a partner. So after April or May, it's going to be called Geffen Werber Law Group. I'm happy to bring my partner Ben Werber into becoming a named partner and help me work these closings here in South Florida like we've been doing for a number of years already.
Thank you for being here. And of course, we'll be reaching out to you in the future with more questions. Thanks so much.